Cool. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this panel about how to convince decision makers. And it's great. I will quickly introduce the panelists for today. I think all of them actually have quite successful experiences on how they decided many, many times their decision makers in their companies or in their client companies. So yeah, let me actually start with Thomas. Thomas is the Vice President Extended Reality at Endava. And before that, he has been Director Immersive Media at Exocet. He directed and grew the VRTS department and represented the company on this topic. Courtney Harding is the global thought leader, published author, and a speaker on emerging technology and the role of virtual and augmented reality. She is the founder and CEO of Friends with Holograms, a transformational VR/AR agency focused on creating innovative, powerful, and effective experiences for training. Clients include Walmart, Verizon, Accenture, Pwc, Coca-Cola, and the US Air Force. Claudia Babescu, passionate about transformative power of technology, Claudia founded Marmot Labs on the belief that training and coaching should adapt to how you learn. She works closely with learning and development professionals to explore solutions for existing problems and how technology fundamentally transforms the way we train and work. And Graham, who you've already seen today, and just right before this panel, yeah, he's now at Innoactive, and before has been working across new technology and content from inception to market. He has a long-term experience from the telecommunications industry before moving to manager B2B. And yeah, now he's at the Innoactive team, as you've just heard. As business development and partnership lead. So yeah, welcome everyone. Yeah, so I would just like to ask you a quite open first question. What are actually the arguments that you usually use to convince decision makers? Like just very general, your own decision makers at your own companies, or maybe decision makers yeah, in other companies. Does someone want to take the first word?
I'll jump in. Why not? So there's two things. One is return on investment. So there is tons and tons of data out there about how much more effective VR is for training than other modalities. Pwc Report, I believe somebody was mentioning. I actually just finishing up a big project with Pwc. You know, I've seen a lot of that data, that report. Like, it's a great piece of data. There's other reports. There's something about Imperial Medical College of London, had some great results. I mean, our deck is just like full of these stats. So the ROI is one thing. COVID has changed that a little bit too, actually, for the positive in VR, because, you know, the argument I would get a lot was like, what about classroom training? What about in-person practice? And it's like, well, that's not happening anytime soon. So, hey, you know, you can't, that's off the table at this point, right? So there's that. And the other thing that I've found, honestly, too, is at this point, there's a little bit of like an envy factor, because a lot of big industries have at least one or two flagship players that are, you know, really big into VR right now. So like Walmart's a great example. They're one of our clients. They've done a ton of stuff in VR. It gets very easy to then go to Target and say like, hey, Walmart's eating your lunch. What are you doing? Right. So you can kind of see a lot of these industries are now really starting to like play catch up and freak out a little bit. And, you know, I think that's great for VR going forward, because all of a sudden, like, they realize how far they're realizing how far behind they are. And now they want to get ahead of it.
Thank you. Do you agree with that, Thomas?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's also making lives a little bit easier than compared to a couple of years ago, when there were very few popular brands and companies that actively used it. Now more and more companies are using it. You have an easier case to be made with decision makers. But I actually feel like Graham had such an awesome talk opening up to this. So I feel we're gonna repeat quite a lot of what he suggested. And it is actually, it is important to make sure that we keep supporting that message, that we don't make claims that are gigantic and then we don't follow up with some data that supports that down the road. If we have our first prototypes implemented, and we had big claims in the beginning, and then you don't see anything falling out of that, then it's hard for the same company, but also all the other companies that might deal with that client to really get it started again. We saw something similar when like in the 2015, 2016 area, a lot of first impressions of VR were very sometimes bad, which was like roller coaster rides, you get sick and stuff like that, and then a lot of people were like rejecting VR in general. And now we have to see on the B2B side that we don't make similar mistakes by not tracking some. For example, training is really good to track and really compare, and also embed it as in a wider blended learning scenario, not just have this isolated virtual reality training and not really have it work with the rest of the training. So it's important to also follow up on your claims. I think that's the most important message I wanted to say.
So you're seeing that basically the arguments in favor or in order that are being used in order to convince decision makers are basically changing over the years as well. Is that something you would also like? Yeah. Do you think there's new arguments that are being used, for example, in 2020, Claudia?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think 3 years ago when I was talking to companies, they wouldn't. But now I think the difficulty is to really convince the client to do the right thing, almost. So most clients have heard about virtual reality, and they have a fixed idea on what they want to build. So they want a certain process or a certain environment translated from reality into virtual reality. And it's almost got to the point where, you know, you want to really convince them to do the right thing, to really allow you to understand what is their business, what are their problems, and where VR could fit best. Because often I discovered that this process is not completely intuitive. So obviously, you know, they hear about VR, or they even have a headset at home. You know, one of their kids have it, or they've tried it with friends, or they just decided to order it because they're like into tech. But you really need to spend time to understand the business, understand how you're going to roll something out. Who are your users in that organization? Who are you going to disrupt the most? So it's almost like they're almost like sold on the idea of VR now, or at least some of them, not everyone, obviously, but that's my experience. More and more people are sold on the idea of VR, but we have a duty to convince them to almost do the right thing with VR, because otherwise, you know, you can build the environment, the virtual environment, and you know, you can kind of have like, you know, you'll have a budget and you'll have a success story in a way, but if that training is not really being used, you know, if you haven't changed a process in an organization, then it's almost like, yeah, it's a step backward for the whole industry.
Definitely, yeah. And from a non-agency perspective, maybe Graham, you can also add like what would be for your perspective, like the most useful arguments that you would use.
Yeah, firstly, I think the guys have all spoken a lot of sense there. So a couple of things. I've found it's always good to be very open about understanding what their needs are. Not just their needs, though, but also their, I guess you'd call it their fears, their risks, them as a business. So them as the stakeholder you need to convince, what is their motivation? Is it purely financial? Is it something else? What are their goals? What are their targets? Because then you know how to do that. And as Claudia just mentioned, there's going to be occasions when actually something may not make sense, and you're going to get far more buy-in by telling them actually you'd be better off doing something not in VR here, but this project actually would work in VR. It's all about building a far tighter relationship and a better degree of trust. And although this is a VR panel in a VR forum here, that's the same underlying concept actually as convincing stakeholders for any kind of complex investment-based decision. It's not so different. It's just making sure that you kind of strip out the strip out the, I guess you call it, the complexities of tech for them. But be honest, be open, and don't oversell the benefits, and try and address their fears, whether that is whether that's cost, whether that's safety, whether that's employee retention, whether that's something else. So yeah, they're probably the main things, but it's really about knowing your customers well, listening to them, and then addressing them with a solution rather than just maybe a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, that's also kind of what we're doing at Extra Bootcamp. We are not like trying to sell directly a solution, but rather trying to make the decision makers themselves understand like how a VR product is being built by basically educating developers and managers and designers on how to build VR AR solutions themselves. So while they are hiring for an agency or recruiting an agency, they know specifically what to look at, and and can make better decisions, better understood decisions for themselves. Is there something like a very like difficult argument you encounter often, and that you yourselves struggle sometimes to answer or to counter argument? Like what is the most difficult thing to convince decision makers on?
Well, opening their pockets, I guess. But
yeah, money.
And because all that we're talking about is of course making sense, but in the end, you have to still sell them on spending more money, because if you're taking all this into account, and that it's not just implementing this training, but it's also picking the right training to be implemented in virtual reality, making up your mind what this means for your IT and all those other angles, thinking about it really needing a change management program almost, and also having your people educated, your trainers educated. There's a lot to follow up on once you've implemented a training. So I am a fan of starting lean, because you have to enter somehow, but often that also means that so many pieces of the puzzle are left out at first, and you kind of have to find a place where the budget and all those different requirements meet, and it would be easy if you just say, okay, I have 3 times more money to spend. But at the same time, I think it often comes down to saying, okay, let's focus a little bit more here. Let's not do the whole training, but only do the certain aspect that we think works well. So we also have some budget for these other things that you need to consider, tracking what you're doing, for example, to have some return of investment numbers. Also training your trainers, and also making sure that people in your organization even know about this. So and that's also where it's a little tricky if you just say informing. Rail, it's great what you're doing. So I'm I'm absolutely supporting you. But there's so much that comes into it that sometimes you need that experienced person that has done a couple of different clients, different projects, to have the bigger scope than just how do you do this certain training, or how do you do it in general. So there is advice needed from experienced people like us and others, or it will be tricky to follow up on it.
Oh yeah, you don't want people that don't know what they're doing VR training. Like that's the worst thing that can possibly happen to a company. And we've had a couple situations where, people have basically tried to do it internally and come to us and been like, it didn't work. What are we missing? And we kind of look at it and we're like, well, you're missing everything, right? So you can't just like slap your normal training in a headset and call it VR. Like that just doesn't work. And there's so many, like designing for VR is very, very different than designing for any other medium, right? And I can't tell you the number of companies I've talked to who've tried to do it in-house and like failed utterly miserably because they don't understand. And you can't really just train people up. I mean, you can, like everyone has to learn at a certain point, but it takes a while to get good at it. So yeah, I mean, that's the worst thing I've seen is companies who think they know what they're doing, they don't. And then unfortunately, then they think it's VR's fault, right? So I talked to one company, and I won't name them, but they basically, you know, they spent all this money doing this VR pilot in-house, and it was terrible. I put it on, and I like got sick watching it. It was so badly done. And they were like, yes, VR is awful. VR didn't work. And I was like, no, you didn't work. Like, this isn't VR, man. This is on you. So I was obviously much nicer when I said it to them, but you know, that's the reality of it, is like, this is not the type of thing that you can just sort of do randomly. And I feel like people are now getting it, but it took a while for sure.
And there's also one thing. How about the disruption, Claudia, inside the company when they're new, just being introduced like that?
Yeah, so I guess this is what the you know, all the studies we see online, you know, about the great benefits of VR. You know, like they almost overlook the disruption that's going to be caused by introducing VR. And I don't want to sound negative, because obviously I'm using like this in a slightly like negative way, but you know, it's I want to kind of outline that when you're building something and you want a company to adopt it, and you're building this with them, you really need to get the people that are going to use this, the people whom life you're going to change slightly. You need to bring them on the journey from the beginning, like from like when you're going to design it, how you're going to like prototype it, like have several prototypes. I totally like agree with the lean approach that you've mentioned. And if you can do that, if a client is lean enough to do that, that's the best way to do it. But you really need to understand that at the end of the day, someone is going to need to learn about VR. They're going to need to use it in their job, and you're going to change that. So you need to really introduce a new behavior, and people need to be really comfortable with it. You need to introduce a new habit. And yeah, like I really like when Graham said that, you know, they need to understand this is not there to replace them, to replace the job, or they don't need to feel threatened by the technology itself. So that's why I think you really like, you have to be super honest with the people you're talking, you know, about VR, and take them on the journey kind of end to end. Don't just, you know, say, look, this is going to bring a great return on investment, which it eventually, if done properly, will. But they need to understand there's a process. And yeah, you really need to involve people and understand that that's going to disrupt someone's job eventually. So yeah.
I mean, that's what Graham said before about stakeholders. You need to stakeholders for training people, the experts, the managers. You need stakeholders from different parts of this and bring them in from the beginning, because they need to be onto this. They need to be part of it. Otherwise, they will just reject it.
Yeah.
And that's why you have to think about the stakeholders from so many different directions.
Yeah, and make sure you don't just take the one enthusiastic person that like they really likes the technology and VR. Make sure you take the skeptical stakeholder as well. They're very important.
The skeptical stakeholder is actually a really interesting one, because they end up being your biggest advocate once you've won them. They take a lot of winning, but once you have won them, they are probably the most important one. So definitely, I mean, I think a couple of you have alluded to this anyway. One of the biggest challenges is just the word change, isn't it? It's people fear change, people are resistant to it. And we've seen a lot of companies in the past few years, and you think they're really moving well with this. But actually what you've seen is, especially in the bigger companies, like an innovation team, a hub of like half a dozen people who are, like you say there, Claudia, they're enthusiasts, they really believe it. But that doesn't mean you've won just because some innovation project works. It's getting from that into standard business, and that's kind of been the big leap that maybe we've seen happening in the last 18 months, but still has a lot more to happen, I think.
Yeah.
Definitely applicable for like a whole lot of use cases, these arguments. But what about when we are looking like deeper down into more concrete use cases, like for example, education? Courtney, you're very, very familiar with these education training use cases. Like what, for example, do we have to add to these arguments when we're, for example, looking at classrooms and education in general?
Well, so we don't work on like K through 12 or university education. We work on training, and so that's a little bit of a different ball game. You know, I think in terms of like classroom training, it's not meant to supplement that. And in fact, VR should be part of a classroom training. So we really believe that you need like at least a debrief session after every training. A lot of the trainings we do are pretty intense. They're really emotional. They've got a lot going on, and they're predicated on the idea that not everyone is going to have the same experience. So, you know, we really help our clients like figure out, okay, what is the context you're getting this training in, and then how are you going to do the discussion around it afterwards. And that can be done online. It can be done like in a Zoom forum. It can be done in a classroom. It can be done in all sorts of different ways. But you really do need to give people the space, depending on the training, right? You need to give people the space to debrief what they said, because that's just as important as the actual experience they've been through.
Definitely. Does anyone else have like a concrete use case where maybe the argumentation would be a little bit differing from the general ones?
I mean, I would say every use case is different, and that's the important thing here. You really have to look at what you want to train, and not everything, not for everything VR is ready. I mean, there is some content that already works with like soft skill training, which is already kind of tricky. If you go into CG, it's often done in 360, and then it's not very interactive. So it's definitely not all solved around there. And the same goes for like skill training in your manual skill, because then you often have those controllers, or you have hands-free, but then as soon as you touch something, it loses tracking. So there, you really, I think it is currently it is very effective if you have some kind of interactivity where you have some agency of actually influencing something rather than just following something. And of course, whenever something has a spatial context, when you have machinery, when you have something, and I think there's huge potential in soft skill training, but it's a little trickier to cover with rendering expressions and all that, and all those experiences have to go into picking the right part of your training that you want to do in virtual reality. And like Claudia said before, often clients come in and they have a very concrete idea of what they want to virtualize and how they want to do it. But then you probably have to say, okay, let's take that part because it really worked. I know it will work well in virtual reality, and maybe do that part in a different form of training. And that's what I mean, like embedding it in a blended learning environment, because you already have all those trainings that you're doing already. No one starts with VR without doing any other training already. So you have to pick a certain aspect of it and then embed that VR training again in your broader training, and pick the stuff where VR is to start with, at least obviously the most effective, and then bit by bit go further and experiment more with things that aren't 100% figured out, I guess.
I just want to clarify that you can do 360 video and make it interactive, and that's basically all we do is for soft skills training. We use actors and actresses. We make it voice we use voice interactivity because that's how we communicate, right?
Yeah.
So you don't need and you shouldn't use CGI characters for soft skills. Mm-hmm. Certainly CGI characters are useful for like hard skills training, medical training, right? You can't ethically, probably legally, cut up an actual body in the training, right? That's when you need CGI. But if you use CGI for soft skills, you get into that uncanny valley space, and then that just doesn't work at all. So, I've heard people talk about 360 video before and how it's not interactive, and I just want to push back that absolutely it can be, it is. You just have to make sure the interaction is realistic and appropriate. But I mean, we've done a bunch of these, and they're definitely doable.
Thank you. So I want to use the last minutes of our panel to ask a few questions of the attendees. So the first one, with our work in Asia, we have found many companies have had it badly and cheaply made, and in turn had a bad experience. This leaves them very anti-VR. Has this happened to you guys, and how have you turned the negative into a positive?
You get what you pay for. Like, people have to realize that. Like, if I buy a shirt at Old Navy or H&M, I mean, no offense to those companies, I hope they're not here, but like, if I buy a shirt for $3 and it falls apart immediately, that's kind of on me, because I should have known better, right? So yeah, if you pay some like animation chop shop in the middle of nowhere, $50 to do your VR piece, like, what do you expect? I mean, there definitely is not a lot of standardization around what VR costs. So I kind of get that confusion, but like, at a certain point, that's on the company to realize, like, this is something you have to invest in, and if you don't invest, you're not going to get anything good.
Yeah, I think you probably look at the value of a trained worker to the company, or a trained workforce. And completely with you on that, Courtney. It's cutting corners, especially when doing something completely new, is not the way to go. Maybe over time, as industries mature, etc., you think of sort of discounting ways. But no, it's really, you, as you say, you get what you pay for there.
I think it's still a tricky thing. Absolutely agree with you pay you get what you pay for, but at the same time, in those companies, it is, you have to get started somewhere, and you can't expect them to spend these multi-million budgets out of nowhere without having any step-by-step proof. So it is a little tricky to find the sweet spot for that specific client to how deep. Like, one of the clients we started with, Siemens, we started with a quick 10K prototype just to have them see, and we invested some of our own, but to have them see, just get an idea of what this can do, you know, and then they saw it in their own machine and they could do it, and then we set up the next steps after that. But there, you always need some kind of entry into it, and you can't do everything at once. You have to lay out like a path through this.
I think the important thing there, Thomas, you mentioned you kind of did a kind of like a call it a POC, but at least you showed them.
That was a really small one, though.
Yeah, but at least they knew then what they were going to get. So it's just classic expectation management, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's a very short question to you, maybe, Thomas. Do you think it's more difficult to implement VR trainings in Germany due to worker union, data protection, or other regulations?
Yes.
Okay, short answer. Is there is there a solution to that? So you will not do any projects in Germany anymore?
No, that's not the solution. But stakeholder management and change management becomes even more important. Like, if you go into like, we had a potential client, we didn't actually end up with the deal, but they already had clean room environments, you know, and you anything the workers are supposed to add to their equipment is an instant no, you know, whatever they say no first, and then you have to think about how can you take the skeptic out of those unions and pick the right one that is the most skeptic, and let them experience this firsthand. And then maybe think about it, is there some kind of scenario where, yeah, it would maybe be even beneficial for us to do that, and then take it from there. But yeah, it can be very, especially with unions and big corporations, they have very, very long ways of figuring or changing anything, and that can be tricky.
Okay, great. One last question we have before concluding the panel. We came in contact with some decision makers or people with influence and put them on headsets and let them use these and check it out themselves. We were surprised that only a minority of these could handle controllers. That's why we came to the conclusion that technology like Oculus hand tracking, which makes VR trainings more intuitive to use, might be crucial to convince decision makers. Have you spotted this particular issue as well? What's your opinion?
I'll probably say something to that, just because I've done thousands of demos over a bunch of years. Nobody is born knowing how to use a controller. We're born knowing how to use our hands. So if you can get hand interactivity, great. There are trainings, though, where actually that hand interactivity is not good enough. And people are still a bit freaked, actually, by seeing hands in VR that aren't their real hands. So it's not quite perfect, but if you're doing generic training, you need to simplify the controls. And it's back to another thing we mentioned a bit earlier, standardization as well. A standardization, so call it trigger to pick up, for example, across all training modules. So you learn something once and you keep that. But it's when we ran the demos, actually, something we did, especially for first timers, it's a bit painful. But before headset on somebody, I would always controller in their hands, show them what it looks like, shows them what it feels like, and show them actually where their thumb would sit on buttons, that kind of stuff. And 2 minutes invested there reaps massive rewards. So just throwing somebody a controller and expecting them to go, it doesn't work. And the result of an experience is only as good as the person who shows it to you in that situation. Sorry, that's a bit of a rant subject. I've lived through that the hard way.
Definitely. No, but thanks for, we will have that as a last sentence, that the person who's showing VR needs to be also as good as the VR experience. Yeah, thank you everyone for this great panel.